At 2:37 a.m. on October 14, 1942, at the Edson's Ridge position on Guadalcanal, the roar of Japanese Type 92 heavy machine guns pierced the dense fog of the tropical rainforest. A hail of bullets slammed into the hastily constructed earth and wood fortifications of the U.S. military, sending dirt and wood chips flying amid the screams of wounded soldiers. John Oliver Wilson, a corpsman from the 1st Raider Battalion of the 1st Marine Division, U.S. Marine Corps, knelt half-crouched at the edge of a shell crater, his left hand pressed tightly against the abdominal wound of a wounded soldier, while his right hand, trembling yet steady, pulled a hemostat from his medical bag. By the dim glow of a flashlight, he attempted to extract the shrapnel embedded in the soldier's abdomen. His military trousers were soaked in blood, and beads of sweat mixed with mud dripped from his forehead. But he dared not allow himself a moment's distraction. At that very instant, 3 Japanese soldiers armed with Arsaka Type 38 rifles broke through the U.S. forward defenses, closing to within less than 10 meters of Wilson's crater. The cold glint of their gun muzzles cut through the night, and beside him stood only an injured rifleman unable to stand, whose M1 Garand rifle held just half a magazine of ammunition. This was not the first time Wilson had faced such a life-or-death decision on the battlefield, but it was the fiercest Japanese charge he had encountered since arriving on Guadalcanal. At that moment, the entire Edson's Ridge line was in critical condition. Of the 3 defensive positions originally held by the 1st Raider Battalion, 2 had been breached by soldiers of the Japanese 6th Infantry Division, and the remaining forces were compressed into a core area of less than 300 meters. Casualties had exceeded 80 men in just 1 hour. As one of only 3 remaining corpsmen in the battalion, Wilson's medical bag was already nearly empty. Bandages, morphine, and hemostatic powder were all running dangerously low. He could only prioritize treating the critically wounded with a chance of survival, while the majority of lightly injured soldiers had to bandage themselves hastily before picking up their weapons and rejoining the fight. The Liverpool-born soldier before him had been wounded in a Japanese artillery barrage half an hour earlier. A shrapnel fragment had severed his abdominal artery. Without hemostasis and initial suturing, within 5 minutes, he would die from blood loss. The Japanese soldiers' battle cries grew closer, interspersed with broken English shouts of, "Surrender and live." Wilson did not look up, remaining focused on his work. He only spoke to the injured rifleman beside him in a hoarse voice. "Hold the left flank. I need 2 minutes." Gritting his teeth, the wounded rifleman propped himself up on his bayonet, struggling to aim his rifle at the approaching Japanese, his finger tightening around the trigger. Wilson moved with astonishing speed. The hemostat clamped precisely onto the severed artery. He quickly tightened a tourniquet above the wound, then picked up a needle and thread to suture the injury without anesthesia. The soldier's body convulsed violently in agony, but Wilson pressed one hand on his shoulder to steady him while continuing his work with the other, his gaze as unyielding as the barbed wire in front of the position. By this time, Edson's Ridge had become a veritable hell on earth. The U.S. 75mm mountain guns had been silenced by Japanese mortar fire, leaving only 2 Browning M 1919 heavy machine guns still putting up a stubborn resistance. Yet these 2 were targeted relentlessly by Japanese grenade launchers, teetering on the brink of falling silent at any moment. The Japanese 6th Infantry Division, known as the Kumamoto Division for its heinous crimes committed during the invasion of China, now displayed ferocious combat tenacity. Disregarding heavy casualties, they employed a wave assault tactic. As one wave fell, another immediately surged forward to take its place. Most of the soldiers charged bare-chested, brandishing bayonet-fixed rifles, screaming wildly as they rushed the U.S. positions. Post-battle statistics revealed that the Japanese had committed 1,200 troops to this offensive, while the defending 1st Raider Battalion numbered only 600 men, including 30 non-combat personnel, giving the Japanese a 2-to-1 numerical advantage and placing the U.S. forces at an absolute disadvantage. Bang! The wounded rifleman's shot rang out, dropping the lead Japanese soldier instantly. The other 2 Japanese soldiers hit the ground immediately and hurled a hand grenade toward the crater. Wilson reacted with lightning speed. The moment the grenade landed, he dragged the injured soldier deep into the crater, shielding him with his own body. A deafening boom echoed as shrapnel whizzed past Wilson's back, tearing deep gashes in his uniform. The searing blast wave left him gasping for breath. Without pausing to check his own wounds, Wilson scrambled to his feet to assess the soldier's condition. Confirming the man had not sustained further injuries, he picked up an M1 carbine from a fallen comrade, worked the bolt, and aimed at the Japanese soldiers closing in once again. He was not a combatant. Under the Geneva Convention, corpsmen were not supposed to engage in direct combat. Their duty was to treat the wounded. But at this moment, the Edson's Ridge defenses were on the verge of collapse, and every man capable of holding a weapon had to become a fighter. Wilson's medical bag was now empty. He injected his last vial of morphine into the critically wounded soldier beside him and said, "Stay here and don't move. Reinforcements will arrive soon." With that, he hunched low and moved quickly to another destroyed trench, where 3 more wounded soldiers were crying out for help. Japanese fire remained intense, bullets kicking up puffs of dirt around him as he advanced, using the shattered remains of the trench walls for cover. At that moment, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commander of the 1st Raider Battalion, was directing the defense from the Corps position. He sent an urgent radio request for reinforcements to division headquarters, receiving the reply, "Reinforcements will take at least 3 hours to arrive. Hold the line at all costs. No retreat is permitted." Edson knew those 3 hours would be the ultimate test for the entire battalion. Corpsmen like Wilson were now tasked not only with treating the wounded, but also with shouldering the burden of combat. Their presence was not just a lifeline for the injured, it was the spiritual backbone holding the defense together. Wilson finally reached the trench where the 3 wounded soldiers lay. One had a leg wound with exposed bone, another had been hit in the chest by shrapnel and was struggling to breathe. The third suffered only a scalp laceration, but was too traumatized to fight. Wilson attended to the chest-wounded soldier first. He quickly unbuttoned the man's uniform and found the shrapnel had not penetrated the thoracic cavity, causing only blunt trauma. He immediately applied pressure bandages to the wound, then adjusted the soldier into a semi-sitting position to ease his breathing. Next, he turned to the soldier with the leg wound, cutting away his trouser leg with scissors, cleaning the area around the injury, and tightening a tourniquet around the upper thigh to stem the bleeding. Throughout the treatment, Japanese bullets rained down around the trench. Wilson's left hand was accidentally grazed by shrapnel, bleeding profusely, but he merely sucked the wound briefly with his mouth before resuming his work. Just then, a dense artillery barrage slammed into the U.S. Corps position, destroying more than half of Edson's Ridge's fortifications. The trench where Wilson was working was hit by a mortar round, and the collapsing trench walls buried him and the 3 wounded soldiers beneath a pile of earth and debris. Summoning every ounce of willpower, Wilson dug himself out of the dirt. A stone had struck his head, and blood streamed down, blinding him, but his first instinct was to claw at the rubble, pulling the 3 injured men free one by one. All 3 had suffered worsened injuries. The leg-wounded soldier had slipped into unconsciousness, and the chest-wounded man's breathing had grown even more shallow. Wilson knew they could not stay here. He had to get them to the rear aid station immediately. The temporary rear aid station lay 500 meters away, a stretch of open ground completely exposed to Japanese fire, with no cover whatsoever. Without hesitation, Wilson slung the unconscious leg-wounded soldier over his back, ordered the scalp-injured soldier to support the chest-wounded man, and took point with the M1 carbine. Taking a deep breath, he sprinted out of the trench during a lull in the Japanese assault, heading for the aid station. The Japanese spotted them immediately, opening up with heavy machine gun fire. Bullets whistled past as Wilson zigzagged frantically to evade the incoming fire. During the run, a sharp tree branch pierced his foot, the searing pain nearly causing him to stumble, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. When they were just 100 meters from the aid station, a Japanese sniper locked onto Wilson. A bullet struck his right arm, sending the M1 carbine clattering to the ground. Wilson cried out in pain, stumbling, but clung tightly to the wounded soldier on his back, refusing to let him fall. The scalp-injured soldier saw Wilson go down and tried to stop to help, but Wilson shouted sharply, "Don't stop for me. Get him to the aid station first." With that, Wilson grabbed a stone from the ground as a weapon and continued to cover their retreat. Fortunately, U.S. soldiers at the aid station spotted their predicament and immediately laid down suppressive fire on the sniper's position with two M1919 heavy machine guns, clearing a safe path for them. In the end, Wilson successfully delivered all three wounded soldiers to the temporary aid station. By then, he was covered in wounds and suffering from severe blood loss. After briefing the medics on the men's conditions, he collapsed into unconsciousness. Meanwhile, the battle for Edson's Ridge raged on, with U.S. soldiers clinging to their final positions through sheer force of will. No one knew exactly how many wounded men Wilson had treated in those 4 hours, nor did they realize that his heroic actions would become one of the most moving chapters of the Guadalcanal campaign. When Wilson woke up, what new trials would the battlefield hold for him? Would he survive this brutal campaign and continue to fulfill his duty as a corpsman? On August 7, 1942, the U.S. military launched Operation Watchtower, the first strategic counteroffensive launched by the Allies against Japanese forces since the outbreak of the Pacific War. The initial landing force consisted of the 1st Marine Division, U.S. Marine Corps, totaling approximately 16,000 men. Their objective was to capture the airfield the Japanese were constructing on Guadalcanal, a facility later renamed Henderson Field by the U.S. military, which would become the focal point of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Prior to this, the Japanese had swept through Southeast Asia and numerous Pacific islands using blitzkrieg tactics, their morale riding high. Guadalcanal, a volcanic island located in the southeastern Solomon Islands, spanned approximately 5,300 square kilometers, covered in dense tropical rainforest, plagued by sweltering heat, high humidity, and hordes of mosquitoes, and crisscrossed by treacherous terrain. It became a natural battlefield hell. From a strategic perspective, Guadalcanal's geographic location was critical. It lay approximately 560 kilometers north of Rabaul, the Japanese military's major South Pacific base, and 1,500 kilometers south of Australia. It served as a key node for the Japanese to cut the Allies' supply lines to Australia and a vital springboard for the Allied counteroffensive against Japan. If the Japanese could firmly control Guadalcanal and its surrounding waters, they could further compress the Allies' strategic space. Conversely, if the Allies captured the island, they could break the Japanese strategic blockade and lay the groundwork for subsequent counteroffensives. Thus, the Guadalcanal campaign was destined from the outset to be a brutal war of attrition, with both sides committing massive amounts of troops and material. Historians would later dub it the Stalingrad of the Pacific. In the early stages of the campaign, the U.S. landing operation proceeded relatively smoothly. The Marines captured the under-construction Japanese airfield in just one day, taking a small number of Japanese engineers prisoner. But the Japanese quickly regrouped, dispatching troops from Rabaul to launch a counterattack against the U.S. forces on Guadalcanal. At that time, the Japanese deployed elements of their combined fleet in the South Pacific, including multiple aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and several elite infantry divisions. Among them, the infamous 6th and 2nd Infantry Divisions, which had perpetrated countless atrocities during the invasion of China. For their part, the U.S. military reinforced the 1st Marine Division with additional units, including the Army's 25th Infantry Division and 43rd Infantry Division, while the Navy committed the main strength of the Pacific Fleet. This led to a series of fierce naval battles around Guadalcanal, including the Battle of Savo Island, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, and the Battle of Cape Esperance. John Oliver Wilson was born in 1918 into a humble farming family in Pennsylvania, USA. In 1940, at the age of 22, Wilson answered his country's call and enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps. Unlike other soldiers eager to earn glory by killing the enemy on the battlefield, Wilson had been imbued with compassion from childhood. His father was a local country doctor, and under his influence, Wilson had learned basic medical care skills from an early age. Upon enlistment, he volunteered to become a corpsman. After 3 months of basic military training and specialized medical instruction, Wilson mastered battlefield first aid, wound management, and treatment of common illnesses. He was assigned to the 1st Raider Battalion of the 1st Marine Division as a battalion corpsman. In July 1942, Wilson boarded the transport ship USS Fort Wayne with the 1st Raider Battalion, departing San Francisco, USA, bound for the South Pacific Theater. During the month-long voyage, Wilson did not idle. He used the time to practice battlefield first aid skills repeatedly, simulating the treatment of common combat injuries, such as abdominal gunshot wounds, leg fractures, and bullet wounds, in the pitching confines of the ship's hold. He also assisted the battalion surgeon in organizing medical supplies, inspecting the quantity and quality of first aid kits, morphine, tourniquets, and bandages. According to recollections from Wilson's comrades later, he also took the initiative to teach the soldiers battlefield self-aid knowledge during the voyage, including how to properly bandage wounds, how to take cover from artillery fire, and how to signal for help after being injured. His conscientiousness and dedication earned him the unanimous respect of his fellow Marines. On August 7, 1942, Wilson participated in the Guadalcanal landing operation with the 1st Raider Battalion. The sea was calm that day. U.S. destroyers and cruisers subjected the Japanese positions on Guadalcanal to a 1-hour artillery bombardment before landing craft began charging the beaches. Wilson was aboard the 17th landing craft. As it approached the shore, it came under sporadic Japanese artillery fire. A mortar round landed just ahead of the craft, sending a towering wave crashing over it and causing 2 soldiers to lose their balance and fall into the sea. Wilson immediately dropped his medical bag, jumped into the water, and rescued both men. One of the soldiers had inhaled a large amount of seawater and was struggling to breathe. On the heaving deck of the landing craft, Wilson performed emergency first aid, helping him expel the seawater from his lungs and alleviating his symptoms. After landing, the 1st Raider Battalion's mission was to capture a high ground on the right flank of the beachhead, clearing the way for the advance of follow-up forces. The Japanese had constructed rudimentary fortifications on the high ground, equipped with light machine guns and rifles, and put up stubborn resistance to the U.S. assault. During the attack, 5 soldiers were wounded in quick succession, 2 of them critically hit by Japanese machine gun fire. Braving enemy fire, Wilson sprinted to the injured men's side, using the terrain for cover to administer emergency treatment. He first bandaged the leg wound of one soldier, moved him to a safe area, then returned to treat the other soldier with an abdominal wound. Throughout the treatment, Japanese bullets rained down around him. A bullet pierced his medical bag, destroying several rolls of bandages, but he never faltered, resolutely completing his work. After capturing the high ground, the 1st Raider Battalion was ordered to garrison the area nearby, responsible for covering the assembly of follow-up forces and the unloading of supplies. At this time, U.S. supply lines to Guadalcanal were not yet fully established, and the soldiers faced numerous hardships, including shortages of food and clothing and relentless mosquito bites. In addition to his daily medical duties, Wilson took the initiative to help the soldiers set up tents and dig trenches. He also used his medical knowledge to treat malaria, skin diseases, and other common ailments among the troops. Statistics show that in the first week after landing, Wilson treated a total of 32 soldiers, 15 for combat wounds and 17 for illnesses. In September 1942, the Japanese launched a large-scale counteroffensive against U.S. forces on Guadalcanal, sparking a series of fierce engagements across the island. The 1st Raider Battalion was deployed to the jungle area in central Guadalcanal, tasked with defending a 2-kilometer stretch of the front line. The jungle's complex terrain and limited visibility made it ideal for Japanese hit-and-run tactics. They frequently launched night raids under the cover of darkness and dense foliage. During one such night attack, Japanese forces broke through the 1st Raider Battalion's positions, wounding 12 soldiers, 3 of them critically, clinging to life. Upon receiving the distress call, Wilson set out alone with his medical bag and flashlight, groping his way through the pitch-black jungle toward the wounded soldiers' location. The jungle was teeming with Japanese soldiers. Wilson could only advance slowly, using trees for cover. He narrowly avoided detection by Japanese patrols multiple times, relying on his courage and calmness to evade capture. Upon reaching the wounded men's position, Wilson found the 3 critically injured soldiers lying in a depression, completely exposed with no cover whatsoever. Japanese fire could zero in on them at any moment. Without hesitation, he began treating the casualties. He first bandaged the head wound of one soldier, then administered morphine to another with a chest wound to relieve his pain, and finally immobilized the fractured leg of the 3rd soldier. As he worked, Japanese bullets struck the ground around the depression, A tree branch scratched Wilson's arm, drawing blood, but he persisted, completing the treatment and evacuating all three men to a safe area in the rear. This nighttime rescue operation catapulted Wilson to fame within the 1st Raider Battalion, earning him the nickname, the Angel in White of the Jungle, among his comrades. But Wilson did not allow himself to grow complacent. He knew more soldiers would be wounded in the battles to come, and his mission was far from over. To improve his efficiency in treating casualties, Wilson modified his medical bag. He placed frequently used first aid supplies and instruments in the outermost compartments for quick access, and coated the bag with camouflage paint to help it blend into the jungle environment. He also took the initiative to request additional medical supplies from battalion headquarters, ensuring he would have an adequate stock of medicines and equipment for future combat. In October 1942, the Japanese launched a large-scale offensive, codenamed the October Assault, to recapture Henderson Field. The Battle of Edson's Ridge was the pivotal engagement of this offensive. Located approximately 5 kilometers southeast of Henderson Field, Edson's Ridge served as a critical defensive barrier protecting the airfield. If Edson's Ridge fell, the Japanese would be able to threaten Henderson Field directly. Consequently, the U.S. military deployed the 1st Raider Battalion to defend this vital stretch of terrain. As a key corpsman in the battalion, Wilson accompanied the unit to Edson's Ridge, embarking on the most arduous and heroic chapter of his Guadalcanal campaign. Prior to the outbreak of the Battle of Edson's Ridge, Wilson had been fighting continuously on Guadalcanal for more than 2 months, treating over 100 wounded soldiers. He himself was in poor physical condition due to exhaustion and multiple minor injuries. Yet he remained steadfast in his post, making final preparations for the impending brutal battle. He inspected every soldier's first aid kit to ensure it was fully stocked and functional. He reviewed battlefield first aid protocols with the men once more, emphasizing how to perform quick self-aid and mutual aid under intense Japanese fire. He also formulated a detailed treatment plan with the battalion's other 2 corpsmen, dividing the defensive sector into zones of responsibility to ensure efficient medical support during the battle. Though Wilson had already endured the trials of multiple engagements, he could not have known that the upcoming Battle of Edson's Ridge would be the most unforgettable battle of his life, and the ultimate stage for him to demonstrate the duties and courage of a corpsman. At 1800 on the evening of October 13, 1942, sporadic Japanese artillery fire began falling on the forward positions of Edson's Ridge. The defensive sector of Company C, 1st Raider Battalion, where Wilson was stationed, was the first to come under attack from Japanese Type 97 mortars. Each incoming shell exploded with a deafening roar, sending dirt flying in all directions. In accordance with the pre-battle plan, Wilson was stationed at a temporary aid station behind Company C's core position. Converted from 2 connected shell craters, the station could accommodate only 4 medical personnel and 10 critically wounded soldiers. He quickly inventoried his final supplies: 32 vials of morphine, 40 tourniquets, 50 rolls of bandages, 15 boxes of hemostatic powder, and basic instruments such as surgical forceps and tweezers. These supplies would be the lifeline for the soldiers in the coming battle. At 1 a.m. on the morning of October 14th, the Japanese offensive began in earnest. Unlike previous sporadic raids, the Japanese employed a frontal assault plus flanking infiltration tactic. 1,200 Japanese soldiers were divided into 3 echelons, launching wave after wave of attacks against the U.S. positions on Edson's Ridge. The soldiers of the Japanese 6th Infantry Division were armed with Arisaka, Type 38 rifles, and Type 11 light machine guns. Some also carried Type 89 grenade launchers, which had a long range and high accuracy, posing a severe threat to the U.S. earth and wood fortifications. The U.S. soldiers of the 1st Raider Battalion were primarily equipped with M1 Garand semi-automatic rifles and M1 carbines, giving them an advantage in fire density, but they were outnumbered and less familiar with the terrain. At 2 o'clock, the Japanese breached the first line of Company C's forward defenses. 2 U.S. soldiers were hit by mortar shrapnel and fell in the open field ahead of the positions, just 50 meters from the Japanese lines. "Corpsman! We need a corpsman!" Cries for help echoed from the forward positions. Upon hearing the call, Wilson grabbed his medical bag and sprinted out of the temporary aid station, hunched over to present a smaller target. At that moment, Japanese bullets swept across the open ground like a hailstorm. Wilson could only advance by leaping from one shell crater to the next, using fallen tree trunks for cover, closing in on the wounded soldiers bit by bit. He moved with incredible speed, timing each dash perfectly between bursts of Japanese gunfire, reaching the first wounded soldier in less than 2 minutes. The soldier had suffered an abdominal wound, with his intestines protruding. His condition was critical. Wilson knelt down quickly, pressing his left hand against the wound to stem the bleeding, while his right hand retrieved hemostatic powder from his medical bag, sprinkling it evenly over the injury before applying a pressure bandage. As he wrapped the bandage, the soldier groaned in agony. Wilson spoke to him firmly as he worked. "Hang in there. I'm getting you out of here right now." After completing the bandage, Wilson slung the soldier over his back and turned to run back to the temporary aid station. Meanwhile, the second wounded soldier was calling for help from a nearby shell crater. A rifle bullet had hit his leg, rendering him immobile. After delivering the first soldier to the aid station, Wilson did not pause to rest. He grabbed his medical bag and rushed back toward the second soldier immediately. Just as Wilson was about to reach the shell crater where the second soldier lay, a Japanese soldier spotted him and charged at him with a bayonet-fixed Arisaka rifle. Wilson had no time to react. He dropped to the ground instantly as a bullet whizzed over his head. As he fell, he grabbed a stone from the dirt and hurled it with all his strength, striking the Japanese soldier squarely on the head. The Japanese soldier screamed and collapsed to the ground. Seizing the opportunity, Wilson scrambled into the crater and began treating the second soldier. He cut away the man's trouser leg with scissors and found the bullet had passed clean through his calf without hitting the bone. He quickly cleaned the wound, tightened a tourniquet above the calf, applied a bandage, then helped the soldier to his feet and slowly made their way back to the aid station. At 2:37 a.m., the moment of intense fighting described at the very beginning, the Japanese offensive reached its peak. Company C's second line of defense was breached, and a large number of U.S. soldiers were wounded. Wilson's temporary aid station was soon overwhelmed with casualties, and his two assistants were stretched to their limits. At that moment, a mortar round landed near the aid station. Shrapnel pierced the station's protective boards, hitting one of the assistants in the chest and killing him instantly. Wilson had no time to grieve. He immediately took over his fallen comrade's duties while continuing to treat the other wounded. His movements grew faster and faster, assessing wounds, administering morphine, bandaging and stopping bleeding, immobilizing fractures. Every step was performed with precision and speed, as if he were an inexhaustible machine. At 3 o'clock, the Japanese had closed to within less than 30 meters of the aid station, and U.S. soldiers began engaging them in hand-to-hand combat with bayonets. Wilson watched as a U.S. soldier was stabbed in the shoulder by a Japanese bayonet and fell to the ground. Without hesitation, he grabbed an M1 carbine from a fallen comrade nearby, worked the bolt, aimed at the Japanese soldier, and pulled the trigger, dropping him instantly. This was the first time Wilson had deliberately fired a weapon to kill an enemy on the battlefield. He knew that only by holding the line could he protect the wounded in the aid station. He placed the carbine beside him, returning to treating the casualties while keeping a vigilant eye on the battlefield, ready to pick up the gun and fire at any Japanese soldiers who drew near. At 4 a.m., the U.S. defensive line had been compressed into the core area, and the temporary aid station was now exposed to direct Japanese fire. Wilson decided to evacuate the wounded to the more secure rear of the core position. He organized the lightly wounded who were still able to move, instructing them to support each other as they made their way to the core position, while he slung a critically injured soldier over his back and led the way. During the evacuation, Japanese fire remained intense. Shrapnel grazed Wilson's back, soaking his uniform in blood, but he pressed on, successfully delivering the critically wounded soldier to the safety of the core position. He then returned to the aid station to evacuate the remaining casualties. On multiple trips back and forth, Wilson was hit by shrapnel 3 times, sustaining injuries to his arms and legs, but he never stopped moving. At 5 o'clock, the first light of dawn began to break in the east, and the momentum of the Japanese offensive began to wane. After more than 4 hours of fierce fighting, the 1st Raider Battalion had suffered heavy casualties. Of the original 600 men, Fewer than 200 were still able to fight. Meanwhile, Wilson and his only surviving assistant had treated over 50 wounded soldiers during this time. Of these, 12 critically injured men owed their lives to Wilson's timely intervention. By this point, Wilson had been working continuously for more than 10 hours, his body exhausted beyond measure. The pain from his wounds caused him to grimace repeatedly, but he persisted in checking on each wounded soldier to ensure none were overlooked. At 7 a.m., U.S. reinforcements finally arrived at Edson's Ridge. Linking up with the 1st Raider Battalion, they launched a counterattack against the Japanese forces. Wilson did not join the counterattack. Instead, he remained at the core position, continuing to provide follow-up treatment to the wounded. He changed their bandages, treated infected wounds, administered antibiotics, and cared for soldiers who had become disoriented due to extreme trauma. During this time, he noticed that an abdominal wound on one of the casualties had become infected, causing the soldier's temperature to rise continuously. Wilson made the decision to perform a debridement immediately. Without specialized surgical equipment, he sterilized a bayonet by boiling it in water and used it as a scalpel to clean the necrotic tissue from the wound, successfully alleviating the infection. On the morning of October 15th, the Battle of Edson's Ridge came to an end. The U.S. military had successfully held the line and repelled the Japanese offensive. Post-battle statistics showed that U.S. casualties numbered 347, while Japanese losses exceeded 800. During the battle, Wilson single-handedly treated 52 wounded soldiers, 28 of them critically injured. Under intense Japanese fire, he repeatedly risked his life to shuttle between the forward positions and the aid station. Not only did he fulfill his medical duties, but he also took the initiative to join the fight, killing 3 Japanese soldiers and making an important contribution to holding the line. His heroic deeds were reported to division headquarters by Lieutenant Colonel Edson, commander of the 1st Raider Battalion, making him a role model for the entire division. After the Battle of Edson's Ridge, Wilson received no rest. Instead, he accompanied the 1st Raider Battalion as they redeployed to another position on Guadalcanal to participate in subsequent defensive operations. In November 1942, the Japanese launched another large-scale offensive to retake Guadalcanal, sparking an even more brutal war of attrition in the island's jungles. By this time, the rainy season had arrived on Guadalcanal, turning the tropical rainforest into a muddy quagmire. The soldiers had to contend not only with Japanese attacks but also with the threat of diseases such as malaria and dysentery, while medical supplies grew increasingly scarce. On November 12th, the 1st Raider Battalion encountered troops from the Japanese 2nd Infantry Division in the jungle, triggering a fierce meeting engagement. Leveraging their familiarity with the jungle terrain, the Japanese employed infiltration tactics, splitting the U.S. forces into isolated pockets and surrounding them. Company C, where Wilson was stationed, was trapped in a valley by the Japanese, cut off from all contact with the outside world. The valley was swarming with Japanese soldiers, and the U.S. soldiers could only put up a stubborn resistance by using rocks and trees for cover. During the battle, 18 U.S. soldiers were wounded, 6 of them critically, requiring immediate surgical intervention. Wilson established a temporary aid station in a cave, which offered relative safety but was cramped and could only accommodate a few wounded soldiers. He emptied the contents of his medical bag and inventoried his supplies, finding only 8 vials of morphine, 15 tourniquets, 20 rolls of bandages, and a dwindling supply of antibiotics. Faced with such severe shortages, Wilson had no choice but to prioritize treating the most critically injured. He boiled his instruments in spring water from the cave to sterilize them, then immobilized the fractured leg of one soldier and performed debridement and bandaging on another with a chest wound. As he worked, Japanese bullets flew past the cave entrance continuously, forcing Wilson to operate by touch alone in the darkness. In the early hours of November 13th, Company C attempted to break through the Japanese encirclement, but met with stubborn resistance, resulting in 10 more soldiers being wounded. Upon hearing the sound of gunfire, Wilson grabbed his medical bag and rushed out of the cave toward the wounded men's location. At this time, thick fog blanketed the valley, reducing visibility to less than 5 meters. Wilson could only navigate by the sound of the soldiers' cries for help. During his advance, he accidentally fell into a booby trap dug by the Japanese. The bottom of the trap was lined with sharpened stakes, which pierced his leg and caused severe bleeding. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he climbed out of the trap and continued pressing forward toward the wounded soldiers. Behind a large rock, Wilson found 3 injured soldiers. One of them had been severely wounded by a Japanese hand grenade, sustaining multiple injuries across his body and clinging to life. Wilson immediately began treating him. He first administered his last vial of morphine to the soldier, then used bandages to dress his wounds. With too many injuries to cover, the bandages were quickly exhausted. Wilson tore strips of cloth from his own uniform to continue dressing the wounds. As he worked, Japanese soldiers spotted them and threw a hand grenade behind the rock. Wilson reacted instantly, pushing the soldier to the back of the rock and shielding him with his own body. When the grenade exploded, shrapnel struck Wilson's back, inflicting a severe wound, but he persisted until he had finished bandaging the soldier. At noon on November 13th, U.S. reinforcements finally broke through the Japanese encirclement and linked up with Company C. By this time, Wilson had been working continuously for 24 hours, treating 28 wounded soldiers. He himself was covered in wounds and lapsed into unconsciousness. The soldiers carried Wilson to a rear field hospital where doctors fought to save his life. After 2 weeks of recuperation in the field hospital, Wilson ignored the doctor's advice and returned to the 1st Raider Battalion, resuming his duties as a corpsman and participating in subsequent battles. In December 1942, U.S. forces gradually gained the upper hand in the Guadalcanal campaign, and the Japanese began a phased withdrawal. The 1st Raider Battalion was ordered to pursue the retreating Japanese, engaging them in numerous skirmishes along the way. Wilson remained steadfast in his post. Whenever a soldier was wounded, he rushed to the scene immediately to provide treatment. During one pursuit operation, a U.S. soldier was shot in the head by a Japanese sniper and critically injured. Braving enemy fire, Wilson sprinted to the soldier's side and administered emergency treatment. Despite Wilson's efforts, the soldier ultimately succumbed to his wounds, but his heroic actions earned him the unanimous admiration of his comrades. Post-battle statistics reveal that during the entire Guadalcanal campaign, John Oliver Wilson treated a total of over 200 wounded soldiers, 87 of them critically injured. Under intense Japanese fire, he made 12 perilous trips between the forward positions and the aid station, evacuating 56 wounded soldiers. He also took the initiative to join the fight, killing 5 Japanese soldiers and assisting his comrades in repelling 4 Japanese attacks. His medical bag was always the soldier's most reliable lifeline, and his figure became a beacon of hope on the hellish Guadalcanal battlefield. In January 1943, the Guadalcanal campaign entered its final phase. After 6 months of brutal attrition, Japanese losses in personnel, equipment, and supplies had far exceeded their sustainable limits. Their sea supply lines had been completely cut off by the U.S. military, leaving the remaining Japanese troops on the island stranded without food or ammunition. On January 14th, the Imperial Japanese General Headquarters officially issued an order for the evacuation of Guadalcanal, codenamed Operation K. By this time, U.S. forces on Guadalcanal had grown to 60,000 men, with ample supplies of heavy weapons and material. They began launching mopping-up operations against the remaining Japanese troops on the island. Wilson's unit, the 1st Raider Battalion of the 1st Marine Division, was tasked with mopping up operations in the mountainous region of northwestern Guadalcanal. This area featured complex terrain where remaining Japanese forces were putting up a desperate last stand from caves and tunnels, making the mopping-up operation extremely difficult. Knowing that retreat was impossible, the Japanese soldiers fought with increasing ferocity, frequently launching suicidal charges, and U.S. casualties continued to mount. Wilson remained steadfast in his role as a corpsman, advancing with the unit and establishing temporary aid stations on the front lines of the mopping-up operation. On January 18th, the 1st Raider Battalion encountered stubborn resistance while mopping up a Japanese tunnel complex. Japanese soldiers inside the tunnel continuously threw hand grenades and used heavy machine guns to block the exit, wounding several U.S. soldiers. Upon hearing the sound of explosions, Wilson immediately grabbed his medical bag and rushed to the battlefield. At that moment, the area around the tunnel exit was completely exposed, with Japanese heavy machine guns raking the ground with fire. Wilson could only advance by crawling on his stomach, inching his way toward the wounded soldiers. He used the smoke from exploding hand grenades as cover to sprint to the side of the first wounded soldier, a man who had both legs blown off and was suffering from severe blood loss. Wilson immediately administered morphine to him, tightened a tourniquet around his upper thighs, and applied pressure bandages to the wounds. As he worked, a Japanese hand grenade landed near Wilson. He had no time to dodge, so he shielded the wounded soldier with his own body. When the grenade exploded, shrapnel struck Wilson in the waist, the searing pain causing his vision to darken, but he gritted his teeth and finished applying the bandages. With the cover of his comrades, he then carried the wounded soldier to a safe area. After briefly treating his own wound, Wilson returned to the battlefield once more to continue treating other injured soldiers. During this mopping-up operation, Wilson treated a total of 17 wounded soldiers, 9 of them critically injured, who owed their lives to his timely intervention. On January 23rd, U.S. forces completed their control of the entire island of Guadalcanal, officially bringing the Guadalcanal campaign to an end. Post-battle statistics show that during the entire campaign, Japanese casualties totaled 25,000 men, including 24,600 dead and over 1,000 captured, while U.S. casualties reached 19,800, with 7,100 killed in action. Wilson's unit, the 1st Raider Battalion, suffered 450 casualties during the campaign, and Wilson personally treated 213 wounded soldiers, more than half of the battalion's total casualties. Of these, 87 critically injured men survived thanks to his treatment, a success rate far exceeding the average for the Pacific Theater at that time. After the campaign's conclusion, the 1st Raider Battalion held a brief awards ceremony near Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Colonel Edson, the battalion commander, personally commended Wilson for his heroic deeds, stating, "In an extremely dangerous battlefield environment, he displayed courage beyond the call of duty and exceptional medical skills, saving the lives of countless comrades and providing critical support for the unit to hold its positions and accomplish its combat mission." At the ceremony, Wilson was awarded the Silver Star Medal, one of the U.S. military's highest honors for battlefield bravery at the time. But Lieutenant Colonel Edson believed Wilson's actions far exceeded the criteria for the Silver Star. He subsequently compiled a detailed account of Wilson's deeds and submitted an application to higher headquarters for a higher honor. In February, Wilson withdrew from Guadalcanal with the 1st Raider Battalion, traveling to Melbourne, Australia, for rest and recuperation. During this period, due to multiple injuries sustained during the Guadalcanal campaign, Wilson's physical condition deteriorated severely, and he was admitted to a U.S. military field hospital for comprehensive treatment. Doctors discovered 3 pieces of shrapnel embedded in his body, along with permanent injuries to his waist, back, and legs. He also suffered from severe malaria and malnutrition. Even so, as soon as his condition improved slightly, Wilson volunteered to assist with medical work at the hospital, helping to care for other wounded comrades. Meanwhile, Wilson's heroic deeds gradually gained wider recognition through U.S. military combat reports and media coverage. His story of risking his life to treat the wounded under intense Japanese fire and taking the initiative to join the fight to repel Japanese attacks became a prominent example of U.S. military propaganda, greatly boosting the morale of U.S. forces across the Pacific Theater. Numerous comrades who had been treated by Wilson during the Guadalcanal campaign wrote letters to U.S. military high command, urging that he be awarded a higher honor. In March 1943, U.S. Marine Corps headquarters officially accepted Lieutenant Colonel Edson's application. After a rigorous review and investigation, Wilson's full heroic deeds during the Guadalcanal campaign were confirmed. He had treated a total of 213 wounded soldiers, including 87 critically injured men. He had made 12 perilous trips between forward positions and aid stations during key battles, evacuating 56 wounded soldiers. He had voluntarily engaged in combat, killing 5 Japanese soldiers and assisting his comrades in repelling 4 Japanese attacks. Despite sustaining multiple injuries himself, he had remained steadfast in his post, never leaving the fight due to his wounds. On May 15, 1943, U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt officially signed an order awarding John Oliver Wilson the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. The citation for the Medal of Honor read, "John Oliver Wilson, Corpsman, 1st Raider Battalion, 1st Marine Division, U.S. Marine Corps, displayed extraordinary courage, selfless dedication, and exceptional medical skill during the Guadalcanal campaign. Facing intense Japanese fire and fanatical attacks, he transcended the bounds of his duties as a corpsman, continuously treating the wounded in the most dangerous areas of the battlefield. He repeatedly risked his life to evacuate critically injured soldiers and voluntarily engaged in combat, providing critical support for the unit to hold its positions. His actions fully embody the noble spirit and fighting will of the U.S. Marine Corps, setting an exemplary standard for all servicemen. On June 10, 1943, the Medal of Honor award ceremony was held at a U.S. military base in Melbourne, Australia. General Thomas Holcomb, Commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps, personally pinned the Medal of Honor on Wilson's uniform. In his speech at the ceremony, General Holcomb stated, "Corpsman Wilson's heroic deeds not only saved the lives of countless comrades, but also embodied the battlefield spirit of never leave a man behind." In the hellish environment of Guadalcanal, his white medical bag became a symbol of unwavering hope for his fellow soldiers. After receiving the Medal of Honor, Wilson became a hero of the U.S. Marine Corps. His comrades' evaluations of him were unanimous. Wilson was never the kind of corpsman who hid in the rear. He was always where we needed him most. No matter how fierce the fighting got, whenever we shouted "Corpsman," he would appear in an instant. He didn't just save our lives, he gave us the courage to keep fighting. Numerous media outlets traveled to the base to interview Wilson. When asked if he had been afraid on the battlefield, Wilson replied, "I didn't have time to be afraid. My comrades were bleeding, and I had to save them as quickly as possible. My duty was to get as many men as possible home alive." Notably, Wilson was one of the few corpsmen to be awarded the Medal of Honor during the Guadalcanal campaign. During the Pacific War, a total of 56 corpsmen from all U.S. military branches received the Medal of Honor, 12 of them from the Marine Corps. Wilson's deeds, characterized by his sustained contributions under extremely harsh conditions, stand out as one of the most representative examples among them. His Medal of Honor was not only a recognition of his individual heroism, but also an acknowledgement of the selfless dedication of all battlefield corpsmen. In July 1943, after recovering from his injuries, Wilson did not choose to return to the United States to recuperate. Instead, he volunteered to return to the Pacific Theater. Taking into account his physical condition and his special status as a Medal of Honor recipient, the U.S. military transferred him to a Marine Corps medical training base, where he served as a battlefield first aid instructor, responsible for training newly enlisted corpsmen. During training, Wilson shared his practical combat medical experience from the Guadalcanal campaign with the trainees without reservation, focusing on jungle battlefield first aid techniques, methods of evacuating the wounded under intense fire, and emergency response measures when medical supplies were scarce. Most of the trainees he instructed later deployed to the Pacific Theater, and many carried on his spirit, risking their lives to treat the wounded in combat. John Oliver Wilson's heroic deeds during the Guadalcanal campaign were not merely an example of isolated individual heroism. They were deeply intertwined with the tactical trends and strategic landscape of the Pacific War. The tactical value, strategic significance, and impact on the U.S. military's battlefield medical system and morale that his actions embodied continued to resonate throughout the later stages of the entire Pacific War. From a tactical perspective, Wilson's actions perfectly illustrated the core logic that medical support is the continuation of combat effectiveness. In a war of attrition like Guadalcanal, his work effectively reduced U.S. mortality rates and indirectly enhanced the unit's sustained combat capabilities. The core tactical feature of the Guadalcanal campaign was close-quarters jungle attrition warfare. Leveraging their familiarity with the terrain and their fight-to-the-death tactics, the Japanese frequently launched close-range surprise attacks, resulting in a high number of acute combat injuries among U.S. soldiers, such as gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and fractures, which carried a high mortality rate if not treated promptly. According to U.S. military battlefield medical data from the early stages of the Pacific War, the mortality rate for acutely wounded soldiers who did not receive timely treatment was as high as 65%. In contrast, the survival rate for critically injured soldiers treated promptly by Wilson reached 82%, far exceeding the average rate for that period. During the Battle of Edson's Ridge, A key reason why the 1st Raider Battalion was able to hold its positions for 3 hours against overwhelming odds until reinforcements arrived was the continuous medical support provided by Wilson and other corpsmen, which kept the number of combat-effective personnel at a viable level. His risky actions to evacuate the wounded not only saved soldiers' lives, but also prevented the risk of intelligence leaks if the wounded had fallen into Japanese hands, thus ensuring the stability of the defensive positions from a tactical standpoint. From a strategic perspective, Wilson's deeds occurred at a critical turning point in the Pacific War. The 1942 Guadalcanal campaign marked the beginning of the Allies' shift from strategic defense to strategic counteroffensive, permanently halting the Japanese military's previous momentum of strategic expansion. Against this backdrop, Wilson's heroic story became a key piece of U.S. strategic propaganda, effectively boosting the overall morale of the Allied forces. At that time, U.S. soldiers across the Pacific theater were widely burdened by the psychological pressure exerted by the Japanese military's Bushido ideology. Wilson's image as a healer in arms became a powerful symbol that shattered this psychological fear. His story spread through combat reports and media coverage to all Allied units, reassuring soldiers that even in the most brutal battlefield conditions, reliable medical support was available, greatly enhancing the unit's fighting spirit. This boost in morale continued to play a role in subsequent campaigns, such as the Solomon Islands campaign and the Philippines campaign, serving as a critical source of spiritual motivation for the Allied strategic counteroffensive. Wilson's deeds also drove the reform and improvement of the U.S. military's battlefield medical system. In the early stages of the Pacific War, the U.S. military's battlefield medical system was designed for conventional plain warfare and was ill-prepared for the unique challenges of jungle combat. Problems abounded, including irrational medical supply allocation, a lack of practical training for corpsmen, and cumbersome casualty evacuation procedures. The 3 principles of jungle first aid, summarized by Wilson during the Guadalcanal campaign, prioritize rapid hemostasis, use simple immobilization to avoid further injury, and utilize terrain for evacuation, were incorporated into U.S. military battlefield medical training manuals. His practical modifications, such as the camouflaged medical bag and the outer compartment quick access design, were mass-produced and applied to the subsequent equipment upgrades of corpsmen. Furthermore, based on Wilson's treatment experience, the U.S. military optimized its frontline medical configuration, establishing forward deployment of battalion-level corpsmen as a standard practice for jungle operations. Each combat company was required to be assigned 2 to 3 dedicated corpsmen, and corpsmen received enhanced basic combat training to enable them to defend themselves and engage in combat under fire. These reform measures directly improved the U.S. military's battlefield medical support capabilities in subsequent Pacific jungle campaigns. Statistics show that by the time of the 1944 Philippines campaign, the mortality rate for acute combat injuries among U.S. soldiers had dropped to 28%, a 37 percentage point decrease from the Guadalcanal campaign period. A deeper exploration of the core role of corpsmen in the Pacific War reveals that Wilson's deeds serve as a quintessential case study. In the Pacific War, corpsmen were not merely medical service providers, they were also the spiritual anchors of their units. Unlike frontline combatants, corpsmen were identifiable by their non-combatant insignia, white armbands, medical bags, and were supposed to be protected under the Geneva Convention. However, the Japanese military repeatedly violated the convention during the Guadalcanal campaign, deliberately targeting U.S. corpsmen, resulting in a corpsman casualty rate as high as 22%. In this context, Wilson's decision to take the initiative to engage in combat broke the traditional perception of corpsmen as non-combatants, establishing a new operational principle for corpsmen of combining self-defense with medical treatment. This principle was subsequently formally incorporated into the U.S. military's corpsman training program, granting corpsmen the right to use weapons for self-defense and to protect the wounded in emergency situations, a measure that greatly improved corpsmen's survival rates and work efficiency on the battlefield. From a historical impact perspective, Wilson's deeds transcend the war itself, embodying the humanitarian spirit in the crucible of battle. As a corpsman, he remained steadfast in his core duty of saving lives and healing the wounded, never abandoning his mission to treat the injured even when forced to pick up a weapon and fight. This spirit was not only remembered by the U.S. military, but also recognized by the international community. His Medal of Honor was not only a personal accolade, but also a tribute to the selfless dedication of all battlefield corpsmen. In the post-war era, Wilson's story was incorporated into U.S. military history textbooks, serving as an important case study for cultivating servicemen's sense of responsibility and humanitarian spirit. The corpsmen he trained continued to carry forward his legacy in subsequent conflicts, such as the Korean War and the Vietnam War, treating tens of thousands of soldiers and ensuring that the spirit of the angel in arms endures to this day. Looking back on John Oliver Wilson's journey during the Guadalcanal campaign, we can clearly see how the perseverance of an ordinary corpsman could shine a light of humanity in the brutality of war, how it could influence the outcome of a battle at the tactical level, and how it could drive the turning of a war at the strategic level. He did not achieve earth-shattering military exploits, nor did he command thousands of troops, but through the 213 lives he saved, he wrote one of the most touching heroic chapters of the Pacific War. His story teaches us that the victory of a war depends not only on the size of the army or the sophistication of the equipment, but also on the perseverance of humanity and the fulfillment of one's duty. The tropical rainforests of Guadalcanal have long since returned to peace, and the traces of the battlefield have been eroded by time, but the spirit of John Oliver Wilson is forever engraved on the monument of military history. His story is not only a commemoration of a hero, but also a tribute to all those who upheld the humanitarian spirit during times of war. It is the extraordinary perseverance of these ordinary individuals that ultimately guided the war toward peace, allowing the light of humanity to pierce through the smoke of battle. If you want to know more stories of unsung heroes in World War II, please subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon to get the latest updates. Thank you for watching.